Okay, well, hello. Welcome to our lunch break study. And on the heels of what we talked about last week, I wanted to continue the conversation and see if, so the Rabbi Waxman piece that we read from Tradition and Change last week, really fascinating, really deep and a great depth. And so often when I'm doing these classes, I'm between choosing something of great depth, because this is a wonderfully smart, interesting group here that's capable of perceiving that depth while also engaging in dialogue and conversation. So I have both of those as my agenda as we work through this curriculum of the foundations of Judaism and the foundations of conservative Judaism. And as luck would have it, I was cleaning up my house recently, and I had crumpled up an article to throw in the garbage, and I realized that it was the perfect article for us to study here. So I picked it out of the garbage, and I am going to share it with you here. And my daughter told me that if you share the screen, when I share my screen, I'm going to share the screen right now. If you, there's something that you can click that allows for you to both see people who are participating in the conversation simultaneously to the document itself. I think it's a split screen or something like that. So what I'm going to do today, and feel free to stop me or raise your hands. Again, I'm very interested in a collaborative conversation as we figure all of this out together. So this is a piece by Harold Kushner. It's called The Foundations of Conservative Judaism, and I apologize for the crinkle marks. Those are mine. And this is a wonderful piece by Rabbi Kushner. If you are not familiar with Rabbi Harold Kushner, I would say if there's probably any American rabbi in the last 20th century who you might be familiar with, it might be Harold Kushner. Rabbi Neil Gilman used to say that Rabbi Kushner wrote the book that has sold the most copies of any book written by a rabbi. And the title of that book is When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And it was, very popular and meaningful and deeply emotional and theological lesson based upon the unfortunate and tragic young death of his child and him struggling with questions of theodicy. So Rabbi Harold Kushner is this great rabbi, of course, in our movement, and he studied and learned from Rabbi Waxman. And so in this piece, which was a book that I stole out of my father's closet, if you look and you see the door behind him, that closet right there behind him, I went into that closet the last time I was in New York, and I stole the books that I liked, and one of them was what do they call this, Fenschrifts? One was like to Rabbi Waxman at the occasion of his 50th year at Temple Israel in Great Neck, and it had this piece from Rabbi Harold Kushner. So we're going to study it now, and he's going to talk a little bit about Waxman, and he's going to list three. Oh, good, it's only 12:04. So I have some time here for the discussion. I have to rush. He's going to list three main features based upon his study of Waxman and based upon Tradition and Change that distinguish the conservative movement from orthodoxy and from reform and from all of the other movements. So does anybody, before I get into it, want to guess at what those three essential characteristics are that are representative of the conservative movement that distinguish us from other movements? Anybody want to try to see what, you don't have to see what you think, maybe what you think Kushner might say. Sandra?
I would think it has to do with the authorship of the Torah, whether we accept research from rabbis.
Wonderful. What is our relationship to research and to what they call Wissenschaft Judentums, which is the scientific study of Jewish texts, history, knowledge, insight? How does that impact our view of the authorship of the Torah? Okay, great, Sandra. That is your suggestion. Bert?
Well, this is more of a joke than anything else, but I heard once of a rabbi, lazy, crazy, and hazy.
Which one are we?
We're the hazy,
We're the hazy. That sounds about right. All right. And which one's the crazy? I guess that's
the
the
orthodox, the
fundamentalist.
reform of the lazy.
All right. Other ideas, other things that you think. What do you think he's going to say? I mean, just take a guess based upon what we've read last week. What do you think he's going to list? He's summarizing tradition and change and Waxman here. What do you think he's going to list are the three key characteristics of the movement? Anybody? I love it. We don't even know. We're a part of a conservative movement, and we're just not sure what it is that distinguishes the conservative movement. Fascinating. I remember last week I asked you to raise your hands if it mattered to you if we left the movement or remained in the movement, and a number of you raised your hands. Dad, Stuart, what do you think?
I think that instead of being rigid and doctrinaire, we will bend as times demand, such as with the pandemic.
Right. So we will bend, we will understand that times
Yes.
change, and we will respond to those needs of the era. We will adjust
Of the time.
our practices accordingly. Great.
So when it came to Pesach, there were a number of rules. We said, look, for the purposes of Pesach, this year alone, you can you can eat these particular foods and don't worry about it, such as tuna fish, cans of tuna fish. They don't have to be with the hashkacha for Pesach. Now I've got a whole stack of tuna fish cans I can eat no matter what.
Right, because once you allow for it, the cat is certainly out of the bag. It's going to be
I
hard to
think so.
rein. It's going to be hard to rein in your Starkist consumption. One more idea on what do you think? What's going to be the key? One of the three key components, key characteristics of the conservative movement. We have, Sandra says, perhaps our reading of history and into who wrote the Torah. Stuart says it has to do with the fact that we will adjust according to the times. Any other thoughts? All right, so let's see what Rabbi Kushner has to say. This piece, I think, will be very digestible in this hour-long class. So, but I am going to maybe go through rather quickly the background. Basically, he says two men taught him what it means to be a conservative rabbi. One was Rabbi Israel Leventhal, his rabbi where he grew up in Brooklyn. And the second was Rabbi Mordecai Waxman, under whom he served apprenticeship at Temple Israel in Great Neck from 62 to 66. I think, Dad, you were a member during those years. In Brooklyn, I saw what a rabbi did publicly, but only in Great Neck did I learn how a rabbi shaped and led a congregation, how he could educate a board to set fiscal priorities, and how he counseled troubled congregants, and how he prepared for a wedding and a funeral. Everything I went on to do in 24 years I spent in the pulpit after leaving Great Neck was a reflection of what I learned from Rabbi Waxman. Rabbi Waxman was the illustrious and learned son of an illustrious and learned father, and he edited Tradition and Change, which, as we talked last week, was one of the seminal books of 20th century American Judaism. So you see at the bottom here, and maybe this might have been your reaction from a little bit that we studied last week, is critics have charged conservative Judaism with lacking a coherent philosophy, with being satisfied to occupy some hazy, right, Bert, amorphous middle ground, more than reform, less than orthodoxy. So we've been accused of a reluctance to spell out what we stood for, lest we potentially alienate members. Oh boy, I'm gonna have to make these bigger, aren't I? Okay, hold on. Okay. Where did I leave off? The accusation, there we go. The accusation has been that just as blue and yellow combined to create green, Orthodox rabbis combined with Reform congregants to create something which is similar to but distinct from the other two movements. Okay, so Rabbi Kushner says that criticism is unwarranted and that there actually is a distinctive, coherent, conservative philosophy that Mordecai Waxman ventured to spell out in the essay that we read last week. Very fortuitous, I think, to find this essay, I would say. So an essay that deserves to be reread more often, both by the movement's adherents and by its critics. It is not a philosophy designed by armchair theologians in their ivory towers, nor is it designed to be intellectually consistent and then applied to life. The conservative movement was created by living, caring Jews, and only afterwards were the theologians able to discern the philosophy behind it. So as he sees it, the philosophy of conservative Judaism rests on these three pillars: the primacy of community. No one mentioned community, interesting. The importance of intellectual honesty. I think Sandra, I think that covers what you were saying there, the importance of intellectual honesty, and the significance of history, which I think, Stuart, you were getting at there, the significance of history. So he's going to go through these three. So these are the three that distinguish, and he's going to go through how that distinguishing, why that is one of the three pillars. So first, let's start with the primacy of community. So he cites a grossly oversimplified aphorism. We've already heard one today, so why not hear another one? Reform Judaism places the center of gravity in believing, orthodoxy in behaving, and conservative Judaism in belonging. So for us, the key function of religion, as Durkheim insisted, is to bring people together in the presence of God, bringing people together so that they don't have to celebrate the joyous moments of their lives or confront the painful ones alone, bringing people together because things happen when we are gathered together that don't happen in the same way when we are by ourselves. Isn't that the truth? Haven't we learned that? This is the idea behind the concept of the minyan, that our prayers change when they are offered in the presence of other Jews. Human beings are social creatures. Some of our deepest emotions are unlocked when we share moments with others. It's the difference between watching a funny movie or a scary movie in a crowded theater and watching it at home on your VCR. You see the ball game better on television, but you experience the game better at the ballpark in the midst of the crowd. And the mourner who is saying Kaddish finds the experience of saying it with a minyan vastly different than reciting it at home alone. He is comforted by the presence of people saying Amen around him, by the knowledge that some of them are also bereaved even as he is, and that others have gone out of their way to make sure that he has a minyan. And the congregants are strengthened by the experience of the person who has the most reason to be angry at God, standing up to praise God. The centrality of community makes some good things happen. It enables us to bring people together as a congregation, even if they don't all believe the same things. We are bound to each other by shared memories and shared loyalties, the way family members are, not only by shared theological opinions. And the bonds that links us is stronger because we don't depend on a shared theological opinion. Kushner writes, non-Jews are often puzzled by the phenomenon of a thoroughly non-observant Jew who nonetheless feels passionately Jewish. It has no analog among Christian denominations. A non-observant Catholic is usually angry at the church. An atheist Presbyterian is a contradiction. But a non-observant, God-denying Jew, while not a model Jew, is unqualifiedly a member of the Jewish people, both in his mind and in ours. And it is the conservative movement. This is where I mentioned Catholic Israel last year and Mordecai Kaplan's definition of Judaism as a civilization. That is the conservative movement that not only recognized the paradoxical truth, but made it the cornerstone of our understanding of Judaism. One of the fundamental structural differences between Judaism and Christianity is that we were a people before we had a faith, and Christianity was a faith before it had a people. It began with an idea, and people who were attracted by that idea formed communities around the idea. That is why in Judaism, theology is less important, and our concern for our fellow Jews is relatively more important. When a Jew gets up an hour early to attend minyan, to make sure that his neighbor will be able to say Kaddish, it's not because he feels the need to pray to God. He can pray at home. It is his community he is affirming, not his theology. The centrality of community also answers a question for us that bedevils other revelation-based religions. If we are right, doesn't that make everybody else wrong? If we know the truth about God, then people who have different ideas must be mistaken. Kushner says, I was once on a radio program when a gentleman called in and patiently explained to me that if I didn't give up my religion and adopt his, God would send me to hell for eternity. I thanked him for his concern and added, even if you're right, and God sends people to hell for having the wrong theology, I think I would rather spend eternity in hell with Mahatma Gandhi than in heaven with you. But if religion is about community, not about definitions of God, then we can have community and they can have theirs. Think of it this way. When my neighbor says to me, my wife has got to be the most wonderful woman in the world, that is not a statement of fact. It's a statement of love and loyalty. He's telling me how much he loves and appreciates his wife. So I don't have to argue the factuality of it with him. I don't have to say, no, I'm not sure your wife is the most wonderful woman in the world. I think Meryl Streep is more wonderful. Or I think Hillary Rodham Clinton is more wonderful. I can recognize it for what it is. In much the same way, when my neighbor says my religion is the path to heaven and salvation, when my neighbor goes to the football games and holds up the sign in the end zone, John 3:16, I can take that as a statement of love and loyalty, not an attack on the legitimacy of anyone who differs from him. So I don't have to argue the point with him. I can say, yes, I know how much my religion adds to my life, and I can appreciate how much it adds to yours. That is the first pillar. Gary Sokol.
So as soon as you stated this pillar of community, and when he was going through his thing, I said, how can he not say Schechter and Kaplan? And he got to that. You didn't say the date, but one thing that I'm stunned by is the ultimate definition of community is not the religious side, it's Kaplan's concept of the Jewish center. I mean, I know on Long Island, you belong to Midway Jewish Center, Jericho Jewish Center,
Nick Sills
Plainview
Jewish Center. You got it.
And that is the ultimate concept of community. Your whole life revolved around that, from your sports teams to Mahjong.
That's correct. And this is my frustration with the current way that we divide up Jewish movements or Jewish peoples. It's all along these theological things, and that's not how we Jews do it. We Jews can come together as a community for other
So
reasons.
when did he write this?
So I guess the 50th year was, what do you think, Dad? What was early 90s is my guess? My guess is early 90s.
He wrote it for his 50th anniversary.
Which was when?
He came to Temple Israel in 1947, so it would be 1997.
Okay.
So it's amazing that he doesn't mention the Jewish center concept. Then he goes all to the observance religious side and not to the whole idea of community, which is the whole idea of the Jewish center,
He does nod to it. I mean, I think he does sort of nod to it. And I love the juxtaposition sort of. I really like the Catholic Israel idea. And Catholic Israel is sort of Judaism as a civilization. And so he's owning that as the conservative movement. We own Catholic Israel and we own Judaism as a civilization. That comes out of our movement. Other thought. What did you guys think of Kushner? I mean, come on, that's great rabbinics there. That was good stuff. I mean, I don't know. Sandra.
I like the fact that he draws on Emil Durkheim, who wrote The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. Durkheim was interested in the beginnings of religion, and I like that he goes back to think struggle and think about this.
Yeah. Do you think that that's a fair pillar to say that this distinguishes Beth Sholom from other places in, from a Reform synagogue or from a Orthodox synagogue, this sense of community? Do you think do you think his expression of it is, I mean, I kind of like that. I thought it was really, really nice. Is it other? Yeah, Jeff.
Do you agree with his first sentence, how he summarizes the three denominations?
No.
Okay.
No, and he, I almost wish he hadn't used it.
Because I would have flipped the Reform and Conservative movements. I would have thought that the Conservative movement is more concerned with theology, and Reform movement with Jewish self-identification.
Yeah,
Reform movement doesn't really much care what you believe.
Where was that here? Yes, the grossly simplistic aphorism. Here it is. Oversimplifies the aphorism with which many of us are familiar. Center of gravity in believing. Well, I guess ultimately what he means by that, it's about what you believe, Jeff. And ultimately what you decide is your belief system. And, you're not going to substitute your belief system for anybody else's. I guess, but you're right. It does sound a little awkward. Gary.
No, actually, in the definition of reform, they do state a factor in belief. You can be Jewish by conservative or orthodoxy and not by reform, and that you have to act to be a reformed Jew, patrilineal or matrilineal. You have to actively pursue Judaism. You're not just accepted because, as a conservative or Orthodox Jew, your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. In Reform, your mother can be Jewish. If you do something to stray from that, you are not considered Jewish in their eyes. And there are examples where people are recognized as Jewish Orthodox, but not Reform. It's weird because you actively have to assert your belief.
Wow. So that we don't require that. We here, Stuart.
Also, Orthodox requires community, and to say that it doesn't, I think that's one of the things that community. You need community to have a mikvah. You need community to have a kosher butcher. I mean, that's a key to Orthodox Judaism.
Yeah, so I guess what he's saying, it's a grossly oversimplified aphorism that he's pointing to here, but orthodoxy in behaving. They're just more concerned. They're concerned with community, no doubt, Dad. But I guess what Rabbi Kushner would say is they're more concerned that you behave properly. And then they're concerned about the community. That is the argument here. So let's go to his second pillar.
The Orthodox are concerned with conformity of behavior.
Perhaps, yeah, that's going to depend on the community and to what exactly.
And you don't meet their standard. You're not part of the community. Your kids can't play with the other person's kids because they may not like your level of kashrut or anything else.
And that's why behavior trumps community, as opposed to letting community supersede behavior. Marcia.
Well, I think one of the things that I kind of liked what he said about conservative Judaism was he said that, it's about the community, which means it's about minyan, and it's about the person who shows up so that other people can say Kaddish, not because that person feels the need to pray. And
Don't you love that?
That's
is that
the
great?
linchpin of our minyan.
Is that great? I mean, that stands for who we've been. I mean, that's our minyan, Marcia. I love that. Amen. All right, so let's go now to the second pillar. Intellectual honesty. Sandra, this was the one that you pointed towards. So Solomon Schechter, back to Schechter, in the course of trying to clarify where the conservative approach to Jewish tradition differed from the Orthodox approach, coined the term artificial ignorance to describe the efforts that devout and naive believers employ to continue believing things that evidence indicates are not true. If one tries hard enough, one can ignore all sorts of evidence. Thus, artificial ignorance permits devout Jews and Christians to go on insisting that the world is less than 6,000 years old, despite overwhelming archaeological evidence to the contrary. They will explain to you that when God creates the world 57 centuries ago, God sprinkled it with dinosaur fossils for no other purpose than to test the faith of people who would come along and discover them centuries later. Artificial ignorance permits people to go on believing that the weather is influenced by the ritual behavior of Jews, as the book of Numbers and the Siddur would tell us. It lets them insist that the Torah was written single-handedly by Moses at God's dictation. Here you go, Sandra. Despite its inner contradictions and signs of internal growth. And that all the 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah, even the ones that give names and details from a later period, were written by a prophet in the time of King Hezekiah. And most poignantly, artificial ignorance permits people to ignore the mountains of tragic evidence that life is unfair and to insist that a righteous, all-powerful God gives people the fate that they deserve. And no one is speaking more poignantly than him, having written the book about the awful death of his child. Conservative Judaism, he says, has no room for artificial ignorance. If emet, truth, is one of the names of God, we should have no reason to fear the truth. If something is true, we should be able to accommodate it within our concept of Torah. If Galileo and Darwin are right, if Freud is right, if biblical scholars have discovered the composite nature of the Torah, then it is our obligation to accept and welcome their truths, indeed to honor them for having expanded the domain of Torah in our lives. The religious person who hides from an unsettling truth because they conflict with his cherished beliefs is like the patient who avoids seeing a doctor, lest he be told that his symptoms are serious. It is a dangerous and short-sighted way to purchase equanimity. Truths can never be God's enemy, nor can artificial ignorance be a path to God. Thoughts? Thoughts on that part? That's pretty strong. It might even challenge some of Neil Gilman's work that we've done on second naivete, if you remember some of the Paul Tillich stuff. Gary?
See, on this one, I think he totally fails with conservative Judaism, and he's unfair on orthodoxy. I mean, orthodoxy, Torah Umadah, is broadly, I mean, maybe not by Haredim, but by modern Orthodox, they do accept that. And conservative Judaism does have a problem with intellectual honesty because it can accept things that, okay, it's by our principles, we are egalitarian. Yeah, you know as well as I do at JTS, and I think it still exists, that they have a separate minyan for those people who do not want an egalitarian morning minyan. And you can't have it both ways. Either women have the same rights as men do and are on the same requirements, or they don't. And you're not being intellectually honest when you say, okay, it's, you know, the Marit Da'atra, and he or she gets to decide for the local community. And that's
okay. I like that. So your point is the classic complaint, the hazy, complaint that Bert made up. The can gays and lesbians be ordained as rabbis? This yes and no approach is not intellectually honest, is what you would say. This accepting yeses and nos and living with both of them would seem to undercut his claim of intellectual honesty.
If you say it's okay, then you can't say it's not okay.
Anybody else have any feelings about artificial ignorance? I don't love it. I don't love the artificial ignorance personally. Gilman used to talk about a second naivete. There are times in which we can be inside of the myth, when the idea of God judging us on the Day of Atonement and coming before God and being judged for our sins, when that myth can be very powerful, and there can be what Gilman used, which was from Paul Tillich, who was a mid-century theologian, this idea of second naivete. We can regain a little bit of our naivete by placing us back inside of a myth. And Gilman would say there were times when that worked for him, and there were times when it didn't work for him. I kind of like, I guess maybe I disagree with you, Gary, slightly. I like that sometimes it works and that sometimes it doesn't work. But we never solved that at the seminary. We never solved the dilemma of, because the argument from the downstairs minyan that didn't count women was that we're a pluralistic movement. And part of pluralism should be to validate a traditional expression of prayer. So
Yeah.
We're pluralistic. So we have egalitarian prayer upstairs, and we have an older non-egalitarian form of prayer downstairs. We are pluralistic in that we allow both in our building. But that was an argument that really never, ever carried the day as long as I was there.
Well, it's interesting because you just last week said to me you would never permit a mechitza in our building, or would you permit a minyan where wanted to sit on the upper part of our sanctuary to separate men and women. So
no, because egalitarian is a part of who we are as an institution, and I wouldn't be able to stomach somebody having a service in our building that was not fully egalitarian. So yeah, the conservative movement tried to make that work, but it was not well received, I guess is the way to put it. But you had a whole bunch of people who were very connected to a previous iteration of what Judaism was. Well, let's go on into the Kushner. So our commitment to intellectual honesty permits us to recognize that even the greatest heroes of our tradition were flawed human beings. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and David were not immaculate plaster saints. If they had been, we would find it impossible to dream of emulating them. They were men who struggled with anger, favoritism, fear, and doubt. The lesson they pass on to us is not that human beings can be perfect if they try hard enough, but that imperfect human beings can achieve great things spiritually. Oh, I'll just share one side story. I once gave my sermon about the Akedah and Yitzchak having, I have this idea that Yitzchak really doesn't say too much in the text. And, I think he has some certain interesting qualities about him. And I said, he might have some learning disabilities here because he really never communicates with Abraham. Oh my God, the Chabadnik just went after me. How dare you say that about our forefather Yitzchak? How dare you criticize the character or call into question the character of one of our forefathers or foremothers? And so I think of what Kushner says here as being accurate, at least in that direction. So in this, we are close in the spirit to the sages of Talmud and Midrash. And I would insist more authentically Jewish than are many who wrap themselves in the mantle of tradition. The sages did not hesitate to recognize and draw moral lessons from the less than admirable behavior of the patriarchs. From Abraham's shameful attempt to save himself at the expense of Sarah's honor, right? We talk about that. If you've been coming to our Torah class, we've been discussing that. We learn that even an Abraham is influenced by the moral tone of the community in whose midst he lives. From the incident of Moses striking the rock, instead of speaking to it, we learn that a leader who loses his temper at his follower can no longer be an effective leader. In the same way, we show no disrespect for the Torah when we are troubled by its enthusiasm for capital punishment and the wholesale extermination of Canaanites and Midianites, by its acceptance of slavery and polygamy, and its harsh treatment of homosexuals and religious dissidents. We are not passing judgment on the Torah. We are bringing a conscience shaped by Torah values to our reading of the Torah itself, as once again the sages did in limiting the applicability of some of the Torah's harsher punishments. We know about stoning a rebellious child. We can see the Torah as the word of God, but we need not see it as God's last word. It's quite a statement on any given subject. The laws and moral insights of the Torah are eternally valid, but they were given to an infant nation, a people newly liberated from the demeaning conditions of slavery, inexperienced at making autonomous moral judgments. If some biblical passages seem to convey an incompletely developed moral consciousness, the limitations may be found not in the Torah or in its divine source, but in the audience to whom it was directed and at whose level it spoke. We show no disrespect for the Torah's earliest layers when we judge them in light of its later sensitivity. Pause. Thoughts, responses. Parv?
Can I ask you the comment on that? That's not God's final word. I thought we can't add anything to Torah. So how does he say that it's not the final word?
Let's go back to that line. It's good having a conversation, you and me, Gary. Hopefully, I hope other people participate in the conversation as well. But that's a great. So here it is. That's too bad that came right on the page break. Hold on. There we go. Here we go. We can see the Torah as the word of God. We can, as a movement, right? Sandra was saying, we can see Torah as the word of God, but we need not see it as God's last word on any given subject. So your argument is, oh, I thought prophecy stopped, right? That's your argument, is that prophecy was called to an end at the, right? Is that time of prophecy is over? Is that where you're going?
Yeah,
with
but it actually is interesting because it also goes after the Oven of Achman. It goes against that too, because that says basically prophecy is stopped and now it's in our hands to make the interpretation. So it's like twists everything we know about rabbinic Judaism on its head.
Well, I think he's trying to say this. I mean, I'll apology for him if anybody else. There are a whole bunch of people here I haven't heard from, so I'm not going to call on you, but we would love to hear from you. My apology is he's saying, look, we know now that, let me take one of his examples. Hold on. Like we know now that the slavery, the polygamy, the harsh treatment of homosexuals and religious dissidents, the wholesale extermination of the Canaanites and the Midianites, right? Our history, right? Who said history? We respond to history. History shapes our understanding of God. And we have gained greater insight just with Galileo and just with other means of knowledge and understanding. We've gained greater moral insight. This is very much connected to Gordon Tucker's Teshuvah of Meta Halacha that we studied 6 months ago, which is that we have greater awarenesses now. God has made God's presence known to us in ways God could not have 3,500 years ago. And we are, as a movement, are just not going to ignore that or feign artificial ignorance of it. Meryl.
So getting back to Rabbi Waxman and Rabbi Kushner, I'm thinking about the changes which some of you may just take for granted because they happened before you were born. But I'm looking at that time period, the 50s and the 60s, and the big split with the Orthodoxy at that time. Jews started moving to suburbia after the war. So, if you were Orthodox, you still had to walk to shul, or you would walk 2 miles or 3 miles, or you wouldn't go. So the conservative movement said, no, it's all right to drive to shul. It's all right. I mean, there were obviously no cars when at the beginning. Another thing, the bas mitzvah, the bat mitzvah for girls, that also took hold in that time period. I remember, this is before you were born, before we had any children. We were in Temple, Israel. It was about 1972. And there's a Friday night service, and the big discussion was, should women be counted in the minyan? So and that's also everything, women and gays, and it has to, that's why his book was called Tradition and Change. It's based on the tradition, but it has to change according to the world. And when we think about the ways in which it has changed that some of us may take for granted, it really has been adaptable, and I would suspect it's going to have to adapt more as we go forward.
And thank you, Mom. That is why we're beginning this year with this series of discussions on the foundations of Judaism, the foundations of our movement, and how are we going to adapt? We're in a different world now. None of us have actually been physically present with each other, so that's different, right? I see Jeff, who lives in Boston, as much as I see Don. I don't even know where Don lives. So, we are in a different world right now, and Judaism is going to have to respond. And this leads us perfectly into what he considers the most distinctive of the 3 pillars. And I think maybe goes to you, Gary. He might express it in a better way here, which is the sense of history. Let me just make this a little bigger for you. And this brings us to the most distinctive feature of conservative thought, a sense of history. I would insist that the crucial difference between ourselves and the Orthodox lies not in our theology, nor in our level of observance, a quantitative analysis of how many mitzvahs we heed, but in our insistence that halacha has a history, in the ways in which Jewish obligation has expressed itself. The ways in which Jews have heard and responded to the commanding voice of God have not remained static from Sinai to this day. Sometimes they changed to reflect changing social conditions. Hillel introduced the Prose Bowl, virtually annulling the Torah's explicit mandate to cancel debts in the 7th year, which reflected the shift from an agricultural society where it was unthinkable to press a neighbor to pay back a loan to a commercial society where it was a requirement of doing business. So you had to adjust the halacha because you no longer were in that agrarian culture. Who knows what culture we're currently going into? Marriage customs reflected the same shift. In an agricultural society, even today, a man must pay for a wife, compensating her family for the loss of a worker, as Jacob had to compensate Laban. In a commercial society, the family paid a dowry for the protection of their daughter, guaranteeing her support if her husband died or failed to feed and clothe her. Similarly, the enhanced public role of women in Judaism reflect the evolution. This is just what Meryl was talking about, of the society around us, inviting the participation of women in all areas of contemporary life. And sometimes Jewish law changed as the collective Jewish conscience matured with them, with experience and with exposure to the values of Torah, affecting our attitude toward capital punishment, toward illness as punishment for sin, toward our attitude to non-Jews. Jewish law was never static. It was a living organism shedding dead cells and growing new ones. To deny that is to deny the evidence of Jewish history. And again, it is conservative Judaism that not only recognizes this in its scholarship, but shapes its understanding of Jewish life today in the light of this understanding. So I'll just pause there. Gary, Gary's not buying it still. All right, that's fine. Other.
No, I like this a lot. But I think that it's just saying Kaplan that which gives meaning to our Judaism as a community is that which we
Interesting. Yeah. Does the tradition have a vote, not a veto? It's interesting. You could read that into this. Very good. Bert.
Well, I think it all starts with, if not the Torah, with the Bible as a whole. I mean, things that are stated in Genesis and things that are stated in prophets and they're not all the same. I mean, I remember Rabbi Lou talking about when Abraham interchanged the three angels, he serves them a cheeseburger. That was the way Rabbi Lou phrased it in his Rabbi Louian way. And so, yeah, and another part, I mean, as I've always seen it, is people are arguing with God all throughout. I mean, God tells Saul, kill everybody. Saul says, no, I'm not. Well, he doesn't say it. He doesn't. So, I mean, I think the history as he expresses and as Meryl expressed, it's all true, but it goes back to the Bible itself.
That's correct. It flows directly from our text. That's right. I mean, that's what Kushner is saying. I think that's what we say as a movement here. Stuart.
You tell me more about that cheeseburger. What?
Remember, you know that the angels appear. Abraham calls him in, and he calls his wife. He says, "Go get the goats and the curds. Serve them meat and curds." He says, "Prepare a meal of meat and curds together." Hence the cheeseburger.
That's cheeseburger.
Well, according to Rabbi Lou.
I didn't know what curds were. I thought it was like grains or something.
What Little Muppet.
Go right ahead, Meryl.
So when we're talking about how the world has changed, one of the things that we have now that we didn't have in the last century is DNA testing. So, my understanding, and I could be wrong, was the reason for matrilineal descent was because you always knew who the mother was. You didn't always know who the father is. Now, basically, you can know who the mother and the father is. Would that enter into this, or is that a different category?
Well, it would enter into it, but it would definitely call into question some of the basic notions they had, because it doesn't even matter who the DNA is. The only thing that matters is the body with which it came through into being. That's what matters. So basically, let me give you an example. And I've been asked this as a direct question. If someone surrogates a child and they surrogate it with Jewish DNA, but the surrogate mother is not Jewish, is the baby Jewish? The answer is no.
Ooh.
Because the only thing that matters is the vagina through which the baby was birthed. Sorry, but that is, so what you're saying, and by the way, why is that significant? Well, because that's how you knew whose the babies was back then. That was a pretty surefire way to determine.
But now you don't need that.
So you'd have to then really begin to detangle a whole series of thought and thousands of years worth of discussion about how we determine who belongs in the group and who belongs outside of the group, which is exactly what we're probably going to have to do. Rabbi Joel Roth used to say, when I was in rabbinical school in 2003, he used to say, by the time 2020 rolls around, he really said this, by the time 2020 rolls around, you are going to have to presume that any couple, if there's a partner in a couple that you're going to marry, you have to presume if they're coming from a Reform household that they're not Jewish, and you have to convert them. Your presumption has to be that they're not Jewish because of the way that the Reform movement has defined who is in and who is out. So I guess, by the way, Meryl, if you were to take your DNA knowledge about who belongs to who, the next question, I guess the next question is DNA the most significant thing? And I know some unappealing people who do believe it is.
No,
I go down that stream of thought. It leads to consequences that I'm uncomfortable with.
No, that's not my point. My point is that I think that the Klal Yisrael better get together on the definition of who is a Jew.
That's not going to happen. But I love the optimism. Not until if Mashiach comes, it'll happen. When Mashiach arrives, we'll all agree.
Actually, to make it even more complicated, if you have a child by surrogacy in Israel, as you say, the child will not be Jewish unless the birth mother was Jewish, birth canal. But for you as an Israeli to bring that child back to Israel, if you're the many gay fathers who have children in the United States or India or wherever, they have to prove paternity to bring that child back to Israel to get the citizenship, and you have to present that in the courts.
Wow.
So how does this empower and make the Jewish community better by having all these ridiculous stipulations?
Well, it depends on which stipulations you think are ridiculous and which stipulations you think are not ridiculous. So, I mean, that's, by the way, but that's the conversation we want to have, and that's the conversation that the community, each generation is going to have to figure out how to worship in a way that's resonant with it, in a language and with the metaphors that speak to it. And that's what he's saying here. So perfectly on point. It was probably necessary for Jeremiah's contemporaries to be told that the temple was destroyed because of their neglect of the covenant, not because of the superior might of the Babylonian army. Without that message, they probably would have concluded that the Babylonian gods were stronger than the God of Israel and become Babylonians as other conquered people did. But it would be nothing short of blasphemous to say something similar to the survivors of the Shoah in our time, that their calamity was a punishment for their sins. It would be wrong. Not because Jeremiah was wrong, but because theology also has a history. God may be unchanging, but what we need from God will change from generation to generation. Change does not always mean substituting truth for falsehood. Change does not always mean substituting truth for falsehood. And it doesn't have to mean substituting brass for pure gold. Sometimes change means replacing what was right for another age with what is right for our age. It was probably appropriate for Jews in the medieval world, a world defined by obedience to authority, to be told, Gadol mitzuvah ve'oseh, misher anoi matzuvah ve'oseh. It is more praiseworthy to keep the mitzvot out of a sense of obligation than to keep them out of a free choice, right? In the medieval world, that probably was wise. But we can't speak that way to our congregants today because the concept of obligation no longer works, because it probably shouldn't work for adult American Jews, because the most significant, the most loving thing our congregants ever do Jewishly is to choose to take their Judaism seriously in a context where there is no way on God's earth to compel them to do so, to take their Judaism seriously in a context where there is no way on God's earth to compel them to do so. How do we do that? That's the challenge. Now, what is conservative Judaism? It is Jewish tradition transposed into the key of freedom. I love that, right? Jewish tradition transposed into the key of freedom. It is a Judaism of citizens of democracy, Jews who choose their spiritual commitments, who choose to be obligated rather than accepting the obligations imposed upon them. It is inescapably true that conservative Jews today are less halakhically observant than their ancestors in Eastern Europe, although there was probably more sinning going on then than we would like to imagine. And we should not make the mistake of comparing Orthodox theory to conservative practice. But that does not mean that today's Jews are less committed to Judaism. It tells us only that the circumstances of their lives, the choices available to them, are different from their forebears. It might well be harder to be a serious conservative Jew in Great Neck in the 1990s than to be a completely observant Orthodox Jew in Poland in the 1890s. In the first century of the Common Era, after the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, the leaders of the Jewish people had to reinvent Judaism. They fashioned a portable religion of prayer and mitzvah to replace the temple-centered cult. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the leaders of contemporary Judaism have once again been called on to reinvent Judaism, substituting a system of voluntary compliance and personal quest for fulfillment for the authoritarian system of pre-modern Judaism. And by the way, certainly we've been called upon to reinvent Judaism for a 21st century post-COVID or during COVID environment. So conservative Judaism is, and for the foreseeable future will continue to be a work in progress. I would venture to predict that future generations of Jews will look back with gratitude at the Mordecai Waxmans of our time and see them as the equivalents of Yochanan ben Zakkai and Maimonides. This essay was my own effort to repay Rabbi Waxman for all that he taught me by extending his ideas about the philosophical underpinnings of conservative Judaism. Natick, Massachusetts, 1995, he was given an award. So that's probably 97. Thank you, Merrill. All right, so I have a few people here in the chat here. We were all at Sinai. Okay, thoughts? Yeah, Don.
Yeah, I just like the concept of the freedom to choose Judaism and not necessarily based on the past. I mean, you can use the past, but the way I see it is that you can actually choose it if you even have no history.
That's right. There's a dynamism to Judaism, and to apply, I mean, I think this is what you're saying, correct me. There's a dynamism to Judaism that when you immerse yourself in it is applied to the generation that you are in a dynamic way, as opposed to just accepting wholesale something which came previously. I think, I'm not sure, was that what you were getting at? But you can.
Yeah, and you can do both. You can take what was useful for you from the past, whatever you want to take, but you can be you can take it, but you can be free. You can be free of everything that was in the past. You can like start new. Like,
is he saying that? Is he saying
now?
that? Is he saying that? Do you think he's saying that? You think he's going that far, Kushner?
Maybe.
This was Gary's point too. This was very similar to the point that Gary was bringing up earlier, which is you can really read him as a really full-on Kaplanian, which would say that the past, right? Orthodoxy says, well, whatever the past said, we have to go by, or where they were closer to Sinai than we are. But here, we have greater revelations that are revealed over time. And history changed the way that we perceive things. And we have to craft, in light of our modern understanding of who God is, speaking to us through morality and through science, with some sort of balance with the tradition that we came from. Judah.
I just love the term work in progress.
Yeah, me too. I love it. Tell me why.
Well, somebody who's more familiar with Orthodoxy may disagree, but I mean, just to me, that does not apply to Orthodoxy, that there is progress going on. To me, it seems very, but then again, you go back to what you just mentioned, they're doing closer to Sinai than, when you're progress, somehow you're getting further away from Sinai. So I think that's we accept that as being something good, and Orthodoxy doesn't.
Yeah, and we're torn. So the name of the book is Tradition and Change. So, we don't know exactly. I don't know if anybody saw that new movie by Tenet. If anyone saw Tenet, it wasn't very good. The Tenet movie. It's all about the people from the future coming and attacking the past. So, in a certain ways, we have this clash between the future and the past. And I think, as Don is saying, that's right. That's, Rabbi Gilman used to say this movement should be defined as the movement intention, where a movement that is sitting in that, and we're not going to give easy answers. We're not going to hide behind a little amount of artificial ignorance, but we're going to try to hear it. And I think the part that I think you all are saying as well, what happens if we're just going to go the way of history then? If we're just going to go the way of history and follow this, then where is the traditional part? And I think it might be a legitimate criticism of this particular essay to say that the emphasis is a little bit more on change than it is on tradition. But I would love if somebody maybe that I haven't heard from wants to say something. Dara or Marv or Howard, Sandy. Dara, yeah.
Well, the tradition is inherent. I mean, where does the change come if it's not based on the tradition? So I think the fact that he's concentrating on the change and adaptation to our present day doesn't negate the fact that it's taken from these traditions. So I'm not sure I would raise that objection.
I like that. I think that's right. And I think that, the main sin, if you will, the wicked child at the Passover Seder is the one who removes themselves from the conversation. And so it seems like the conservative movement, this is my vision. And this is the vision expressed here by Kushner and expressed by Waxman. It's the same vision. The vision is to be able to have a space in which, people don't all have to agree on what God is. People don't all have to agree on how they're going to worship that God in their home. People don't all have to agree on the things that it compels them to do, but we can all agree that we are part of this Jewish center that can engage with these texts and with each other in the pursuit of that. And for me, with 2 minutes left to go, I'll close with this. That, I think, in our tremendously separated and divided world is sorely needed and called for. And I think we have a very sacred responsibility as a community here to hold up that sacred center, as Martin Buber would call it, that living middle, where we all can congregate. We might disagree on what we think God is or how we think we should practice, but we're all going to be part of that same community and engage in the conversation. So I'm going to stop the recording right here.